In this video, I'm going to show you how to calculate risk and relative risk using SPSS. To start, we're going to form our 2x2 grid. We're going to do this on paper first, and then we'll go to the SPSS. So in our 2x2 grid, we're going to put our outcome of interest, or our disease of interest, across the top, as always. So we've got our outcome in the first column, and our alternative outcome, or no disease, in the second column. And then on the left side, or for our rows, we're going to put our exposures. So we'll have our experimental group, or the exposure of interest, and our comparison group, or our control group, as our second row. Let's put in some numbers here. Let's say that 80 patients who were exposed developed the disease of interest, and also from the exposed group, 920 did not develop the disease, for a total of 1,000 patients who were exposed. Likewise, in the comparison group, we have 420 who did develop the disease, even though they weren't exposed, and 8,580 who did not develop the disease, for a total of 9,000. Now, what we are interested in is the exposed event rate, which is the risk of the disease if you are exposed, the control event rate, which is the risk of the disease if you're not exposed, and finally the relative risk, sometimes called the risk ratio, which is just the ratio of those two things, the relative risk between the exposed event rate and the control event rate. So let's calculate those numbers. The exposed event rate is simply A over A plus B in our 2x2 table, which in this case is 80 over 1,000, or 8%. So the risk of developing the disease, or having a certain outcome if you are exposed, is 8%. The control event rate is C over C plus D, or in this case, 420 over 9,000, or 4.7%. So the risk of developing the disease or outcome if you are not exposed is 4.7%. The relative risk is just the ratio between those two numbers. So it's the exposed event rate over the control event rate, which in this case is 8% over 4.7%, and that gets a number, the relative risk, 1.7. So in this case, you are 1.7 times more likely to develop a disease if you are exposed. Now let's take a look at this in SPSS. Okay, so here I have my SPSS as it is when you first open it. And the first thing you need to do is set up your variables. So we're essentially setting up our 2x2 grid. So our columns, as we have them, was our outcome. So the outcome will go on the top. And I always just make this look pretty. We're going to label this, we're going to code this 1 or 2. 1 is they do have the disease, and 2 is they don't have the disease. So I will label this as 0 decimals and a width of 1. We just have one number with no decimals we're going to be putting in here. The measure is nominal, and the values then, 1 we're going to say is disease, and 2 is no disease. Just like that. So that is our outcome. Now we're also going to set up our exposure. So we'll put that as well, and we're going to likewise label this as a 1 or a 2. So the value here, 1 will be exposure, and 2 will be no exposure or control. Okay, so there's one other variable that we need to put in here, and that's the frequency. And the frequency, oh, and by the way, the exposure will be a nominal variable. The frequency is going to be a scale variable, and again, we're going to pull this down to 0 decimals, and we'll pull it a width of 4. Okay, those are our variables. When we go to the data view, we can see these listed for us. I'll make these a little bigger so that we can see them. And you can check this box up here. This is your value box so that you can use your value labels instead of 1 or 2. So my outcome, I'm just setting up my grid. My columns will have a disease. My columns will have a no disease. My exposure will be exposure, no exposure, That's to get us started. So for the disease and the exposure, we have a number of 80 cases. This is what we had in our 2x2 grid. For no disease and no exposure, so this is our true negative, this is going to be 8580. For the disease and no exposure, we're going to have 420. And finally, for no disease and exposure, we're going to have 920. All right, so there's a few things we need to do to calculate, and then we'll be all set. The first thing is to go to our data, and we're going to weight the cases. So what we're going to do is we're going to weight cases by frequency. The reason we do that is we're saying that each one of these numbers represents this many cases of this, because normally in SPSS, each one of these numbers down the side is correspondent to a person. So I would have to do disease exposure 80 times if I didn't have this frequency box. So this tells me that I want to weight this by 80. Likewise, all of these will be weighted as well. So I did that. Finally, we're going to analyze our data. So we're going to do a descriptive statistics, go to our crosstabs, which is equivalent to the 2x2 table here. Our columns, remember, the thing that we're putting on top is our outcome. The exposure will be our rows. We're going to go into cells, and we're going to modify this because we are interested in our row percentages. Think about it, A over A plus B is going across, that's the row. So those are the percentages that we're interested in. That's how we're going to get our risk. So we'll continue. And finally, under statistics, we're going to check the box for risk. All right, I'm going to run that report, and we are just about done here. We see we have 10,000 cases, which does match up with our numbers. You can see that the exposure, 80 with the disease, 920 without the disease. We have disease, no disease, exposure, no exposure. This is exactly the same as our 2x2 grid. The only difference is we also get the risk here. So we have an 8% risk, that's the number that we calculated, of developing the disease when you are exposed, and a 4.7% risk of developing the disease if you are not exposed. Those are the exact numbers that we calculated just a moment ago. Finally, in our risk estimate, because this particular study was a cohort study, we're looking for a risk ratio or a relative risk, not an odds ratio, although they are calculated the same. But our relative risk here is 1.714, which is more accurate than what we calculated at 1.7, but it's pretty much the same number. We had some rounding that we did. So 1.714 is our relative risk. And just to be clear, we also have the 95% confidence interval. So this is 1.362 up to 2.158. We can be 95% confident that our relative risk is somewhere in that realm. And because it does not cross 1, the null value, then we are good. We can believe that something actually is happening here, and we can confidently say that we're pretty sure that someone is 1.714 times more likely to develop a disease when they are exposed as to if they are not exposed. All right, so that's how you use SPSS to calculate risk and risk ratio.